8 white men in Phillips County, Arkansas, believed they had fathered the same child. Each one received identical letters in the fall of 1857, written in careful script, claiming paternity and demanding protection for a newborn infant. What made this case extraordinary wasn't just the deception itself, but the fact that the woman who orchestrated it was enslaved, illiterate, and according to county records that survive to this day, had never been taught to write. The letters were too similar to be coincidental, too specific in their details to be forgeries, and too dangerous to ignore in a society where such accusations could destroy families, end political careers, and ignite violence that would consume entire communities. By the time authorities began investigating, 3 of the men had already made arrangements to purchase the woman's freedom. 2 had confronted each other with loaded pistols, and 1 had disappeared entirely from Phillips County, abandoning his plantation and his wife without explanation. The case was buried so thoroughly that it never appeared in newspapers, never reached a courtroom, and was deliberately excluded from official county histories, preserved only in private correspondence and plantation ledgers that weren't meant to survive. Before we continue with the history of Phillips County's most dangerous woman, I want to ask you something. This channel brings you the darkest, most carefully researched mysteries from American history. Stories that were deliberately hidden and almost lost to time. If you're hearing this, you're a part of a community that refuses to let these stories disappear. Take a moment right now to subscribe to Liturgy of Fear. And down in the comments, tell me what state or city you're listening from. I want to know where our community of truth seekers is growing. Now, let's discover together how one enslaved woman in 1857 Arkansas managed to deceive 8 men, manipulate an entire county's power structure, and nearly escaped slavery through a scheme so intricate that historians still debate whether she acted alone. The autumn of 1857 would become known among certain families in Phillips County as the season of reckoning, though none of them would ever speak of it publicly. Phillips County, Arkansas, stretched along the Mississippi River's western bank, where the water ran brown with soil from 1,000 miles upstream, and the land lay flat and fertile under skies that turned the color of brass in summer heat. The county had been officially organized only 23 years earlier, carved from territory that had belonged to the Quapo people until forced removal, and by 1857, it had transformed into one of the wealthiest cotton-producing regions in the state. The population numbered just over 8,000 souls, though that figure depended entirely on whether one counted enslaved people as souls or property, a distinction that mattered greatly in census records, and not idle in daily life. Ella Lanina, the county seat, perched on a bluff overlooking the river, its warehouses stuffed with cotton bales waiting for steamboats that churned upstream from New Orleans. The town had been named for the daughter of a land speculator, and it retained a certain speculative quality, a sense that fortunes could be made or lost in a single growing season, that a man's status depended on his cotton yield, his enslaved workforce, and his ability to manage both without appearing to exert effort. 3 churches served the white population, their steeples competing for dominance over the skyline. 2 hotels accommodated travelers and traders. 1 newspaper, the Helena Shield, published weekly editorials about states' rights, cotton prices, and the superiority of Southern civilization. The Quapo Quarter, as locals still called the area south of Helena, despite the absence of any Quap, contained some of the most productive plantations in Arkansas. Here. The soil was especially rich, the drainage especially good, and the men who owned the land especially wealthy. They had names that appeared in state legislature records, bank charters, and steamboat company manifestos. They served on county commissions, church boards, and militia committees. They married each other's sisters and cousins, educated their sons at colleges in Virginia and South Carolina, and maintained a social order that seemed as permanent and natural as the river itself. Among the enslaved population of Phillips County, information moved through networks invisible to white oversight. News traveled from field to kitchen, kitchen to stable, stable to dock to another plantation's field, creating a secondary circulatory system of knowledge that white owners preferred to believe didn't exist. They told themselves that their enslaved workers were content, loyal, simple-minded, incapable of complex thought or coordinated action. This willful blindness would make possible what happened next. The woman known to county records only as Celia belonged to Hamilton Drury, a cotton planter whose holdings encompassed nearly 2,000 acres south of Helena. Drury had purchased Celia in 1851 from a estate sale in Cho County, acquiring her along with 7 other enslaved people when the previous owner's debts exceeded his assets. The bill of sale described her as approximately 19 years old, healthy, suitable for field or housework, and noted without further detail that she had been trained in textile production. The price paid, $4.75, suggested she was considered neither particularly valuable nor defective. An unremarkable acquisition for a man who bought and sold human beings with the same attention he gave to purchasing mules or farming equipment. Hamilton Drury was 41 years old in 1857, married to a woman named Margaret, who had given him 4 children, all daughters, a source of persistent disappointment that they rarely bothered to conceal. His plantation, Riverbend, employed an overseer named Virgil Tucker, who managed the day-to-day operations, while Drury attended to business in Helena and maintained social obligations that he considered essential to his status. Tucker was a lean, hard man from Tennessee, who had learned plantation management in the cotton counties along the Mississippi, and who believed that violence efficiently applied prevented the necessity of more violence later. He carried a blacknake whip coiled on his belt and used it with casual regularity, though never enough to damage valuable property beyond its ability to work. Celia worked primarily in the plantation house by 1857, having been transferred from field labor after Margaret Drury noticed her careful hands and quick understanding of instruction. She cleaned, cooked, served at table, and performed the invisible labor that maintained the appearance of effortless white comfort. She spoke when spoken to, kept her eyes down in the presence of white people, and had learned to make herself unremarkable, a skill that required constant attention and considerable intelligence. But Celia possessed something that would prove far more dangerous than intelligence alone. She understood patterns. She watched how men behaved when they believed themselves, and observed how they justified their actions, how they revealed their fears and desires through small gestures and unguarded words. She had learned to read not letters on a page, but the deeper grammar of power, violence, and self-deception that structured Southern society. And she had realized something that would change the trajectory of her life and nearly unravel the social order of Phillips County. The men who owned and controlled everything were also the most vulnerable to certain kinds of manipulation because their power depended on maintaining appearances that were fundamentally fraudulent. The scheme that would later shock Phillips County began forming in Celia's mind sometime in early 1857, though the exact genesis moment remains impossible to determine. What is certain based on later testimony and preserved correspondence is that by March of that year, she had identified 8 specific men who could be exploited, had analyzed their individual vulnerabilities, and had begun the careful, dangerous work of making each one believe he had a secret relationship with her. The 8 men came from different situations, but shared crucial characteristics. All were white. All were property owners or men of business. All had reputations to protect, and all had access to Celia through the normal operation of plantation society. They were not strangers or outliers but respected members of the community. Men whose word carried weight and whose social position seemed unassailable. Hamilton Drury was the obvious first target given his ownership and the access that provided, but Celia's plan required more than one man, more than one potential claim of paternity. It required a web of conflicting interests, mutual suspicion, and shared guilt that would make exposure dangerous for everyone involved. The second man was Josiah Frell, who owned the plantation adjacent to Riverbend. Frell was 53, childless despite 2 marriages, and known for his regular visits to Drury's property under the pretense of discussing cotton markets and river commerce. That he was also known, though only among the enslaved community, for his habit of walking the property lines at dusk and his attention to women working in the fields nearest his land. The third was Virgil Tucker, the overseer, whose position gave him authority over every enslaved person at Riverbend, and whose cruelty was matched only by his dependence on his employment. Tucker had no property of his own, no family in Arkansas, and no prospects beyond his current position. That he was in many ways the most dangerous and the most vulnerable of the 8 men. The fourth was Samuel Pritchard, a cotton factor in Helena, who arranged sales and credit for multiple plantations, including Riverbend. Pritchard visited frequently to review accounts, inspect warehouses, and assess crop quality. He was 38, married to a woman from a wealthy Memphis family and cultivating political ambitions that required an absolutely spotless reputation. The fifth was Dr. James Rankin, who served as physician to several plantations in the Quaker Quarter. Rankin made regular calls to Riverbend, treating illnesses among the enslaved workforce with the same dispassionate efficiency he applied to treating valuable livestock. He was 45, a widower and known for his discreet handling of sensitive medical matters. The sixth was Reverend Thomas Hartwell, minister of the Presbyterian Church in Helena, who occasionally visited plantations to preach to enslaved congregations, a practice that was considered both pious and useful for maintaining social control. Hartwell was 32, recently arrived from Virginia and eager to establish himself as a moral authority in his new community. The seventh was William Dvor, a riverboat captain who transported cotton from Helena to New Orleans and whose boat the Delta Star docked regularly at the Riverbend landing. Dvor was 41, unmarried and spent more time on the river than on land. A man whose mobility made him both useful and difficult to track. The eighth was Benjamin Yates, a lawyer in Helena who handled property transfers, estate settlements, and contract disputes for the county splanter class. Yates was 36, married, father of 3 sons, and known for his meticulous attention to documentation and legal precedent. What Celia understood with a clarity that demonstrated remarkable psychological insight was that each of these men had already crossed certain boundaries in their minds, had already rationalized behaviors that society officially condemned but privately tolerated. The institution of slavery created opportunities for white men to act on desires that would be unthinkable in other contexts. And those opportunities were exercised far more frequently than anyone acknowledged publicly. The enslaved woman who resisted could be beaten, sold, or killed. The enslaved woman who submitted was simply fulfilling her role in a system that defined her as property without will or rights. But Celia wasn't planning to resist or submit. She was planning to weaponize the very system that oppressed her, to turn the mechanisms of power against themselves by exploiting the one thing that could threaten these men: exposure of their hypocrisy, documentation of their violations, and public acknowledgement of truths that everyone knew but no one could afford to speak. The execution of Celia's plan required patience, precision, and the understanding of timing that bordered on genius. She needed each man to believe he alone had a secret relationship with her, that she was somehow complicit in or even desirous of his attention, and that their interactions were private and unobserved. This required her to create opportunities for each man to approach her, to respond in ways that encouraged continued contact without triggering suspicion, and to establish in each man's mind the plausible possibility that he might have fathered a child. With Hamilton Drury, the pattern was already established. He had asserted his claimed rights as an owner from the beginning, and Celia's position in the plantation house made resistance impossible and escape unlikely. But she began to modify her responses, to seamless resistance, to create the impression that she had developed feelings that made Drury's action seem less like violence and more like a relationship. This required extraordinary self-control and psychological manipulation, transforming trauma into theater, survival into strategy. With Josiah Farrell, she created opportunities during his visits to Riverbend, making herself visible when Drury was occupied elsewhere, establishing eye contact that could be interpreted as invitation, allowing herself to be found alone in locations where Farrell's presence could be explained as accidental. When Farrell finally approached her directly in the tobacco barn in late April, she responded with calculated ambiguity, neither refusing nor enthusiastically accepting, creating the impression of a woman who was conflicted but ultimately willing. With Virgil Tucker, the approach was different because the power dynamic was different. Tucker already believed he could take whatever he wanted from any enslaved woman under his authority. But Celia made him believe she preferred his attention to Drury's, that she saw him as stronger and more desirable. This required her to criticize Drury in subtle ways when alone with Tucker, to compare them favorably to Tucker, to create the illusion of genuine attraction. Tucker, whose position made him despised by the enslaved community and isolated from white society, was particularly susceptible to this manipulation. With Samuel Pritchard, shused his vanity and his fear of social exposure. Pritchard considered himself more refined than the plantation owner she served, more educated and sophisticated. When he visited Riverbend in May, Celia made sure to demonstrate that she could read numbers in his account books, could understand complex transactions, could recognize the quality of his clothing, and the newness of his watch chain. For a man who spent his days flattering wealthy clients, the attention of an enslaved woman who seemed to admire his accomplishments was intoxicating precisely because it required no performance, no calculation of social advantage. With Dr. Rankin, she exploited his professional distance and his isolation as a widower. When he examined her during a routine medical inspection in June, she asked questions about medicine and health that suggested intelligence and curiosity, creating a connection that felt intellectual rather than physical, though it inevitably led to the same place. Rankin convinced himself that he was educating her, that their interactions were somehow elevated and different from the crude violations practiced by men like Tucker. With Reverend Hartwell, the manipulation was most delicate and most dangerous. Hartwell visited Riverbend in early July to preach to the enslaved congregation, delivering a sermon about obedience and Christian duty that Celia endured with apparent attention. Afterward, she approached him with questions about salvation and biblical interpretation, creating the impression of spiritual hunger that Hartwell found irresistible. He began visiting specifically to continue these conversations, which gradually shifted from theology to more personal matters. Hartwell convinced himself that he was saving her soul, even as he violated every moral principle he preached. With William DeVore, the riverboat captain, Celia used his mobility and his separation from land-based social structures. When the Delta Star docked at Riverbend in late July, she made sure to be visible on the landing, helping load supplies and giving DeVore the impression that she was free to move about the plantation with minimal supervision. DeVore, who spent most of his time surrounded by male crew members and whose visits to ports were hurried and anonymous, found the possibility of a recurring connection with the same woman appealing in ways she hadn't anticipated. With Benjamin Yates, the lawyer, Celia exploited his professional pride and his need to appear exceptional. When Yates visited Riverbend in August to review property documents, she managed to be present in the room, appearing to dust or straighten furniture, but actually paying attention to the legal language Yates used, the way he organized documents, the logic of his arguments. When she asked him a question about property law, pretending confusion, but demonstrating that she had actually understood the basic principle, Yates was flattered in a way that led him to seek out further conversations, which led inevitably to further contact. What made the scheme brilliant was not just the individual manipulations, but the timing. Celia had calculated that for her plan to work, she needed each man to believe he had been with her during a period when pregnancy could have resulted. This required her to compress the timeline to make all 8 men believe they had exclusive access during roughly the same 2-month period in summer 1857. It required her to be extraordinarily careful about visibility, about ensuring that each man believed his interactions with her were secret while actually creating a situation where all 8 were acting on the same assumption of exclusivity. By late August, Celia was able to announce, first to the women of the enslaved community at Riverbend, and then carefully and separately to each of the 8 men, that she was pregnant. The news spread through the plantation enslaved community with the speed of all important information, moving from the house to the quarters, from the quarters to the fields, generating speculation and concern. Pregnancy for an enslaved woman meant many things, none of them simple. It could mean temporary reduction in work demands, or it could mean increased surveillance and restriction. It could mean a child who would be enslaved from birth, or in rare cases, it could mean leverage that might lead to freedom if the father was white and powerful enough to care about his offspring. But what made this pregnancy different, what made it immediately remarkable to the women who knew Celia best, was the quiet confidence she demonstrated. The sense that she had planned this rather than endured it, that she saw the pregnancy not as another form of exploitation, but as an opportunity she had created. To each of the 8 men, delivered separately and in circumstances that ensured privacy, Celia revealed her pregnancy as a secret that only he knew, presenting it as both a burden and an opportunity, a problem that required his help and a connection that bound them together. She was careful never to demand anything immediately, never to threaten exposure, but simply to state the fact and observe the reaction, to let each man's guilt, fear, or vanity drive his response. Hamilton Drury's reaction was dismissive initially. Enslaved women had children constantly, and their paternity was irrelevant under law. Any child born to Celia would belong to him as a property regardless of biological parentage. But Celia's response, delivered with careful timing, introduced a complication. She mentioned, as if casually, that others had noticed her pregnancy and might speculate about the father. She mentioned Margaret Drury's sharp eyes and suspicious nature. She mentioned that servants talked among themselves and that information sometimes reached mistresses through channels. Master scowled and control. Drury's dismissiveness transformed into unease. Josiah Frell's reaction was immediate alarm. He was childless, had been married twice without producing an heir, and had begun to accept that his property would pass to distant relatives after his death. The possibility that he had fathered a child, even one who would be enslaved, awakened something in him that was both proprietary and sentimental. But he was also terrified of his current wife discovering his behavior. He pressed Celia for assurance that she had told no one else, that she would continue to keep their relationship secret, that she understood the danger of speaking to anyone about the child's paternity. Virgil Tucker's reaction was the most immediately violent. He grabbed Celia's arm hard enough to leave bruises and demanded to know if she had been with anyone else, if she was trying to trap him into taking responsibility for another man's child. But Celia's response, delivered without fear despite the pain of his grip, turned his anger into uncertainty. She looked directly at him, something enslaved people rarely did, and asked him why he thought she would risk telling him if it weren't true. She reminded him that she had nothing to gain from lying, that if anything, she was putting herself in danger by telling him at all. Tucker released her arm, his certainty shaken. Samuel Pritchard's reaction revealed the depth of his social anxiety. He immediately began calculating the potential damage to his reputation, his political ambitions, his marriage to a woman whose family connections had advanced his business considerably. He asked Celia multiple times whether anyone else knew, whether she had written to anyone, whether she had told anyone in Helena. The questions revealed his awareness that enslaved people formed networks of communication that white people preferred to ignore, and his fear that information about his behavior might already be circulating in ways he couldn't control or suppress. Dr. James Rankin's reaction was clinical initially, then shifted to something more conflicted. He examined Celia to confirm the pregnancy, using his professional authority to touch her in ways that seemed medical but weren't, and then sat in silence for several minutes before speaking. He told her that she needed to be careful about her health, that he would ensure she received proper nutrition and reduced work demands. He didn't ask about other possible fathers. He seemed to simply accept with the fatalism of a man who had lost one wife and never recovered that he had created this situation and now bore responsibility for managing it. Reverend Thomas Hartwell's reaction was perhaps the most psychologically complex. He immediately began praying aloud, asking for God's guidance, speaking about sin and redemption while simultaneously reaching out to touch Celia's face with a tenderness that contradicted the violence of everything had done. He told her that they would find a way through this trial, that God tested his servants, but also provided deliverance. He seemed genuinely unable to recognize the contradiction between his theological certainty and his personal behavior, existing in two separate mental spaces that never touched or acknowledged each other. William Dvor's reaction was shaped by his mobility. He immediately began calculating distances and timing, asking when she had last seen her monthly courses, calculating backward to determine whether the timeline matched his visits to Riverbend. When satisfied that it was possible, his response was pragmatic rather than emotional. He told her that he would help, that he had money saved, that they could make arrangements when he returned on his next voyage up from New Orleans. He seemed to view the situation as a transaction that could be managed with sufficient resources and planning. Benjamin Yates's reaction revealed the legal mind behind the lawyer. He immediately began asking questions designed to establish facts to determine what evidence existed, who knew what information, what claims could be proven or disproven. But underneath the professional questioning, Celia could sense genuine fear. Yates understood better than the other how easily reputation could be destroyed, how a whisper could become testimony, how private behavior could become public scandal. He told her that she must tell no one else, that she must wait for him to consider the situation and develop a proper response. By September 1857, Celia had created a situation unique in Phillips County's history. 8 men, all white, all powerful in their respective spheres, all convinced they had fathered the same unborn child. None of them knew about the others. Each believed he alone shared this dangerous secret with her, and each was beginning to realize that maintaining that secret required taking actions that would draw attention, raise questions, and potentially expose them to exactly the kind of scrutiny they most feared. The genius of the scheme lay in its timing and its understanding of male psychology. By making each man believe he was the only one, Celia had created 8 separate crisis situations. By connecting each man's guilt to his deepest vulnerability, whether social reputation, political ambition, professional standing, or personal vanity, she had ensured that each would be highly motivated to solve the problem she presented. And by being enslaved, she had created a situation where any solution that benefited her would require these men to take extraordinary, visible, and potentially contradictory actions. What Celia needed was for these men to begin acting on their individual fears and desires in ways that would inevitably bring them into conflict with each other, creating a situation where exposure became a mutual threat, and silence became impossible. October brought cooler weather to Phillips County, and with it first signs that Celia's scheme was beginning to manifest in the material world. 3 of the 8 men, acting independently and without knowledge of the others, had initiated the legal and financial processes necessary to purchase an enslaved woman's freedom. The first to move was Dr. James Rankin. On October 7, he visited Benjamin Yates's law office in Helena and requested assistance in preparing the proper documents to purchase Celia from Hamilton Drury and subsequently Menominee. Yates, who had his own reasons for being concerned about Celia's situation, maintained professional composure while processing this request, but immediately understood its implications that he asked Rankin whether Drury had agreed to the sale, whether a price had been negotiated. Rankin responded that he hadn't yet approached Drury, but wanted the legal documents prepared in advance so he could present a complete proposal. Yates prepared the documents, but filleted a copy in his personal records, a detail that would later prove significant. He also sent a note to his clerk instructing him to monitor any other inquiries about purchasing or manumitting enslaved people from Riverbend Plantation, a precaution that suggested Yates suspected something unusual was developing. The second to move was Samuel Pritchard. On October 9, just 2 days after Rankin's visit to Yates, Pritchard approached Hamilton Drury directly during one of his regular business visits to Riverbend. He mentioned, as if casually, that he knew a cotton factor in Memphis who was looking to purchase a house servant for his wife, a woman who could cook and clean and manage household affairs. He suggested that Celia might be suitable for such a position, that the Memphis factor was prepared to pay a premium price, and that it might benefit Drury to accept such an offer, since house servants were less profitable than field hands in cotton country. Drury, who had no intention of selling Celia, nevertheless took note of the offer and began to wonder why Pritchard was suddenly interested in this particular enslaved woman. The third to move was Reverend Thomas Hartwell. On October 12, he visited Riverbend under the pretext of discussing a fundraising effort for church expansion, but he found an opportunity to speak privately with Margaret Drury about Christian charity and the redemption of souls. He mentioned that he had been particularly moved by the spiritual development of the enslaved women at Riverbend, that she showed remarkable aptitude for scripture and moral instruction, and that he had been contemplating whether the church might purchase her freedom as an example of Christian mercy. Margaret Drury, a devout Presbyterian who had never been consulted about such a matter before, was simultaneously flattered by Hartwell's attention and suspicious of his specific interest in one particular enslaved woman. By mid-October, Hamilton Drury had received 3 separate inquiries about purchasing or freeing Celia, each from respected members of Phillips County society, each with apparently reasonable justification, and each arriving within a span of 5 days. Drury was not a stupid man, and the patent troubled him. He began asking questions of his overseer, of his wife, of other enslaved people at Riverbend, trying to understand what made this one woman suddenly interesting to so many people. But while 3 men were attempting to purchase freedom, the other 5 were pursuing different strategies shaped by their particular situations and resources. William Dvor, the riverboat captain, couldn't purchase Celia himself because his itinerant profession made him unsuitable as an owner of enslaved people under Arkansas law, which required owners to be residents. But Dvor had connections throughout the river trade network, and he began making inquiries about arrangements that might be possible, about people in New Orleans who facilitated complex transactions involving enslaved people, about loopholes in interstate commerce regulations. He also began setting aside larger portions of his earnings, creating a fund that he intended to use for Celia's benefit once he determined the proper approach. Josiah Farrell, the neighboring plantation owner, took a different approach entirely. He couldn't purchase Celia without raising questions about why he wanted a house servant from a neighboring plantation when he had adequate staff of his own. Instead, he began visiting Riverbend more frequently, ostensibly to discuss cotton markets and river conditions, but actually trying to monitor Celia's situation to ensure she didn't reveal their relationship, to assess whether other men were showing similar interest. His increased presence did not go unnoticed by either Drury or Margaret Drury, who began to find his constant visits tiresome and suspicious. Virgil Tucker faced the most constrained situation of all 8 men. As an overseer with no property and limited savings, he had neither the resources to purchase Celia nor the social standing to attempt legal manumission. But Tucker had something the other men lacked: daily physical proximity and direct authority over Celia's life. He began using that authority in ways designed to isolate her from other enslaved people, to control her movements, to ensure that she couldn't communicate with anyone who might threaten his position. He assigned her tasks that kept her in the house rather than the quarters, restricted her ability to attend Sunday gatherings, and watched her with an intensity that the other enslaved people at Riverbend recognized as dangerous. The situation grew more complex in late October when Celia received a visitor who would catalyze the next phase of her plan. A free black woman named Delilah Parsons, who traveled throughout eastern Arkansas as an itinerant seamstress. Parsons had cultivated a reputation as an exceptionally skilled dressmaker, able to create garments that matched current fashion trends from Charleston and New Orleans. Her skill gave her access to plantation houses throughout the region, and her status as free, combined with her apparent focus on feminine concerns like clothing and fashion, made white women comfortable speaking freely in her presence. But Delilah Parsons served another function that white society didn't acknowledge. She carried information throughout the enslaved and free black communities of eastern Arkansas, connecting people and news across distances that would otherwise isolate them completely. She knew which plantations were preparing to sell enslaved people, which overseers were particularly brutal, which white men had mixed-race children they didn't acknowledge, which free black people might offer shelter to runaways. Her network of information was invisible to white oversight, but essential to survival for thousands of people. When Parsons arrived at Riverbend in late October to take measurements for new dresses for Margaret Drury, she spent time in the house with Celia, ostensibly discussing household matters, but actually exchanging information of every different kind. What exactly they discussed remains uncertain, but evidence suggests that Parsons helped Celia with the next phase of her plan, the creation of written documents. The letters that would shake Phillips County were composed sometime in the last week of October, though the exact process remains mysterious. Celia couldn't write, or at least had no formal education in writing. But 8 letters were created, each one identical in content, but addressed to different men, each written in careful script on paper that appeared to be of quality unusual for enslaved people to possess. The letters were brief, unsigned, and devastating. The child will come in February. You know what you done, and you know what is right. The woman who carries your child cannot remain property without staining your honor and your soul. Make arrangements before others learn what you already know. The genius of the letter lay in its ambiguity and its implications. It never identified the sender, never made explicit threats, never demanded specific actions. But it implied that others might learn of the situation, that honor required response, that time was limited for men whose social position depended on reputation and appearance. The letter created immediate crisis. The letters were delivered on the same day, November 2nd, by a process that remains unclear. No postal records document their transmission. No witness later testified to seeing them delivered. But on that day, 8 men throughout Phillips County received identical letters that each assumed came from Celia, and each assumed only he had received. Hamilton Drury received his letter at breakfast, delivered by a house servant, who claimed to have found it tucked into the morning newspaper that arrived from Helena. He read idents, then immediately summoned Virgil Tucker and demanded to know what the overseer knew about Celia's activities, whether she had been seen writing, whether she had access to paper and ink. Tucker, who had received his own letter an hour earlier via a different route, claimed ignorance, but felt his stomach tighten with fear. Josiah Farrell received his letter from a young black boy who knocked at his door and handed him the envelope before running away. Farrell spent the afternoon sitting in his study, reading and rereading the brief message, trying to determine whether it was a genuine communication from Celia or some kind of blackmail attempt from someone who had learned of their relationship. Samuel Pritchard received his letter at his cotton factor's office in Helena, finding it slipped under his door when he arrived for work. He immediately locked his office door and spent an hour considering possible responses, potential consequences, and legal implications. As a businessman who dealt in contracts and agreements, Hunter understood that the letter created a documentary record evidence that could potentially be used against him. Dr. James Rankin received his letter during a house call to a plantation north of Helena. It was handed to him by an enslaved woman who said a traveling seamstress had asked her to deliver it. Rankin read it while standing in Summerneil's house, then had to compose himself before continuing his medical duties. Reverend Thomas Hartwell received his letter at the church, slipped between the pages of his Bible where he would find it while preparing Sunday's sermon. He spent the rest of the day in prayer, alternating between asking God for guidance and convincing himself that his actions had been righteous, that he had genuinely cared for Celia's spiritual development, that any physical relationship had been secondary to his mission of salvation. William Dvor received his letter aboard the Delta Star while docked at Napoleon, Arkansas, 30 miles south of Helena. It was delivered by a boy who ran onto the boat, handed him the envelope, and disappeared before Dvor could ask any questions. He read the letter in his cabin, then immediately began calculating how much money he had available and what arrangements he could make. Benjamin Yates received his letter at his home, delivered by an unknown black man, who knocked at the back door and handed it to Yates's cook. When Yates read it, his legal training immediately activated. He recognized that someone had created documentary evidence, that identical letters might have been sent to multiple recipients, that a scheme of considerable sophistication was in operation. But he also recognized that he was implicated in that scheme and that any investigation would expose his own behavior. The beauty of the timing was that each man received his letter at a different location under different circumstances, making coordination or comparison impossible without revealing to others that they had received such a letter. Each man's isolation was reinforced by his guilt and fear of exposure. Within days, the effects began manifesting in visible ways throughout Phillips County. The second week of November brought unusually cold weather to Phillips County, frost appearing on cotton fields still waiting for final harvest. The Mississippi running gray under overcast skies. But the atmospheric chill was nothing compared to the tension developing among 8 men who were each trying to manage what they believed was a private crisis. Hamilton Drury made the first overtly suspicious move. On November 9, he traveled to Helena specifically to visit Benjamin Yates's law office. He told Yates he was considering selling several enslaved people and wanted to review the legal procedures for such transactions. Yates, who knew exactly which enslaved person Drury was actually concerned about, maintained professional composure while explaining the documentation requirements, but Drury then asked a question that made Yates's hands go cold. He asked whether Yates was aware of anyone else inquiring about purchasing specific enslaved people from Riverbend. Yates deflected the question skillfully, citing client confidentiality, but Drury's suspicion was now explicit. As Drury left the office, Yates sat at his desk calculating the geometry of exposure. If Drury was asking these questions, he knew something. If he knew something, others might soon know. If others knew, the entire structure of secrecy that protected all 8 men would collapse. That same day, Josiah Farrell encountered Samuel Pritchard on Helena's Main Street. They knew each other socially, served on some of the same county committees, attended the same church. Their greeting was cordial, but Farrell noticed that Pritchard seemed distracted, preoccupied. When Farrell mentioned he was heading to Riverbend to discuss cotton prices with Drury, Pritchard's reaction was oddly intense. He advised Farrell that Drury had seemed stressed lately, that perhaps it wasn't the best time for business discussions. The comment was strange enough that Frel began to wonder whether Pritchard knew something about the situation at Riverbend, whether Drury had confided in him, whether the web of secrecy was already unraveling. The first open conflict occurred on November 13. Virgil Tucker, who had been monitoring Celia with increasing paranoia, saw Dr. James Rankin arrive at Riverbend for what was described as a routine medical inspection of the enslaved workforce. Tucker watched as Rankin spent considerably longer examining Celia than seemed medically necessary, and when Rankin finally emerged from the house, Tucker confronted him. What exactly was said between them remains disputed, but witnesses later reported raised voices, aggressive posturing, and Tucker's hand moving toward the pistol carried. Rankin, who was not a physically intimidating man, nevertheless stood his ground and responded with enough force that Tucker backed down. But the confrontation was public enough that enslaved people working in the yard witnessed it. And by evening, word of the altercation had spread throughout the enslaved community at Riverbend and beyond. Hamilton Drury heard about the confrontation from his wife Margaret, who had observed it from a window and demanded to know why Tucker was threatening the doctor. Drury summoned Tucker to explain himself, and Tucker, trapped between confession and continued secrecy, claimed that he had been concerned about Rankin spending excessive time with enslaved women, that it seemed improper and potentially problematic. Drury accepted this explanation, but filed it away mentally alongside all the other strange behavior had noticed recently. By mid-November, Celia was showing visible signs of pregnancy, and her condition was becoming a topic of conversation among the white residents of Phillips County. Margaret Drury, whose relationship with her husband had been strained by his obvious preference for producing sons, began asking pointed questions about Celia's pregnancy, about who might be the father, about whether Hamilton knew anything about the situation. These questions put Drury in an impossible position. If he admitted knowledge, he revealed too much. If he claimed ignorance, his wife would suspect he was lying. The situation escalated dramatically on November 18 when 2 of the 8 men, acting independently, but on the same day arrived at Riverbend with specific intentions regarding Celia. Dr. James Rankin arrived in the morning carrying medical supplies and stating that he needed to conduct a thorough examination of Celia to ensure the pregnancy was progressing properly. He brought with him legal documents already signed, transferring funds to Hamilton Drury in exchange for Celia's sale and subsequent manumission. The documents had been prepared by Benjamin Yates, though Rankin didn't know that Yates had his own reasons for wanting Celia freed. Drury refused the offer immediately with a forcefulness that surprised Rankin. He told Rankin that he had no intention of selling Celia, that her pregnancy made her more valuable rather than less, though they found the doctor's sudden interest in no particular enslaved woman strange and inappropriate. Rankin pressed harder, increasing the offered price, arguing that medical concerns warranted special consideration. Drury's refusal became more heated, and he finally ordered Rankin to leave the property. Rankin departed, but he had barely cleared the front gate when Samuel Pritchard arrived with a similar mission. Pritchard's approach was more sophisticated, involving a complex arrangement where a cotton factor in Memphis would purchase Celia as part of a larger business transaction, avoiding the appearance of personal interest. He presented the proposal to Drury as a business opportunity, emphasizing the premium price and the convenience of the arrangement. Drury's response was explosive. He demanded to know why Pritchard was suddenly so interested in facilitating the sale of this particular woman. He asked pointed questions about the Memphis factor, about who had suggested this arrangement, about whether Pritchard had been speaking with Dr. Rankin. Pritchard, realizing that his timing had been catastrophic, attempted to retreat gracefully, but the damage was done. Drury now knew for certain that multiple men were coordinating efforts regarding Celia, and his suspicions about the nature of their interest were crystallizing into certainty. That evening, Drury confronted Celia directly in his study, a private interview that left no witnesses except the 2 participants. What was said between them remains unknown. But when Celia emerged from the study an hour later, her expression was described by another house servant as calm but cold, like someone who had just won something but couldn't show it. The next day, November 19, Reverend Thomas Hartwell made a fatal error in judgment that he arrived at Riverbend unannounced, claiming he needed to speak with Celia about spiritual matters, about preparing her soul for motherhood, about ensuring the child would be raised in Christian faith. Margaret Drury, whose suspicions had been growing all week, decided to observe this spiritual counseling session personally, positioning herself where she could hear the conversation between Hartwell and Celia. What she heard confirmed her worst suspicions. Hartwell's language, though carefully religious in its surface content, carried an intimacy and personal concern that no minister would have for an enslaved woman unless there was a deeper connection. When Hartwell mentioned making arrangements for Celia's future, promising that she wouldn't remain enslaved, offering assurances that seemed far beyond his authority or means to provide, Margaret understood completely. She confronted her husband that evening with specific accusations that multiple men had been intimate with Celia, that they were now competing to free her or purchase her, that the entire situation was creating a scandal that would destroy their family's reputation. Drury attempted to deflect a claim that Margaret was imagining connections that didn't exist, but his wife had assembled too much evidence. She threatened to leave Riverbend to return to her family in Little Rock to take their daughters and make public statements about her husband's character if he didn't take decisive action. On November 21, Hamilton Drury made a decision that would transform Celia's calculated scheme into something far more dangerous than she had anticipated. He announced to his household that Celia would be sold, but not to any local buyer. He had arranged for her to be purchased by a cotton planter in the Louisiana Delta, far south of Helena, where she would work in field labor until the child was born and then continue field work afterward. The sale would happen immediately within days before she became too pregnant. Ravel. This decision, meant to remove the source of conflict and restore order to Drury's household, instead triggered a crisis among the 8 men who all believed they had a stake in Celia's future. Dr. Rankin learned of the planned sale through his medical network and immediately sent urgent messages to Benjamin Yates asking for legal intervention, for injunctions, for any mechanism that might delay or prevent the sale. Yates, caught between his professional obligations and his personal involvement, drafted documents that might serve Rankin's purpose, but knew they had minimal legal standing. Samuel Pritchard heard about the sale from his business contacts and confronted Drury directly, abandoning any pretense of business neutrality and demanding that Drury reconsider. The confrontation, which occurred at Drury's cotton warehouse in Helena, drew attention from other merchants and factors who witnessed 2 prominent men arguing with an intensity that suggested personal rather than business conflict. Reverend Thomas Hartwell, when he learned of the sale, experienced what witnesses later described as a mental collapse. He was found by church members sitting in the sanctuary, weeping openly, talking about sin and redemption and divine judgment. He became convinced that Celia's sale was divine punishment for his behavior, that God was testing him by placing her beyond his reach. His obvious distress and strange comments created speculation throughout Helena's religious community about what might have caused such a breakdown. Josiah Farrell took the most direct action. On November 23, 2 days before the planned sale, he rode to Riverbend and confronted Hamilton Drury face to face. He offered to purchase Celia himself, matching whatever price the Louisiana planter had offered, arguing that it made more sense to keep her nearby where her condition could be properly monitored. When Drury refused, Farrell made a threat that crossed into dangerous territory. He suggested that Drury might not want certain information about his personal behavior becoming public, that men who lived in glasshouses shouldn't throw stones. Drury's response was to reach for his pistol. Farrell, equally armed, drew his own weapon. For several seconds, 2 wealthy plantation owners stood in Drury's front room, pointing loaded pistols at each other while Margaret Drury screamed for help and enslaved servants fled the house. The confrontation ended without shots fired, but only because Virgil Tucker arrived and physically interposed himself between the 2 men, forcing them to lower their weapons. Farrell left Riverbend immediately, but the incident guaranteed that the conflict could no longer remain private. Too many people had witnessed the confrontation. Too many questions would be asked about what could cause such extreme behavior between neighbors who had been cordial for years. That same evening, William DeVore arrived at Riverbend unannounced, having steamed upriver specifically because word of the planned sale had reached him in Napoleon. He attempted to negotiate with Drury, offering more money than Rankin or Pritchard had proposed, suggesting arrangements that might satisfy Margaret Drury's concerns while keeping Celia in Arkansas. But Drury, exhausted by the constant pressure and increasingly suspicious about how many men seemed invested in known enslaved woman's fate, refused to negotiate further. On November 24, the day before the scheduled sale, Benjamin Yates did something remarkable and legally unprecedented. He filed papers with the Phillips County Court challenging Hamilton Drury's right to sell Celia to an out-of-state buyer, citing an obscure Arkansas statute about interstate commerce in enslaved people who were pregnant. The legal argument was weak and Yates knew it, but the filing created a public record that would delay the sale and force a hearing. Hamilton Drury, reading the court documents delivered to Riverbend in November 25, immediately recognized Benjamin Yates's name and realized that his own lawyer was actively working against his interests. The revelation that Yates was involved in the scheme surrounding Celia, combined with all the other evidence of multiple men's interest in her, led Drury to a devastating conclusion. The child Celia carried could have been fathered by any number of men, that she had somehow manipulated multiple relationships simultaneously, and that he had been played for a fool along with several other prominent citizens of Phillips County. His rage found its target in the most vulnerable person available, Virgil Tucker, the overseer who had authority over Celia, but who had apparently failed to prevent whatever scheme she had orchestrated. On the evening of November 25, Drury dismissed Tucker from his employment effective immediately and ordered him to leave Riverbend before morning. Tucker's response would trigger the final cascade of events that brought Celia's scheme to its climax. Rather than accept his dismissal quietly, Tucker went to the quarters where enslaved people lived and began talking loudly and publicly about what he knew regarding Celia and the multiple white men who had been intimate with her. He named names, described encounters, revealed details that had been secret. His motivation was revenge against Drury for firing him, but the effect was to transform private knowledge held by the enslaved community into public testimony that white society could no longer ignore. By dawn on November 26, everyone at Riverbend knew what Tucker had revealed. By midday, word had spread to neighboring plantations. By evening, the story had reached Helena, where it circulated through merchant establishments, church gatherings, and social clubs, growing more elaborate and scandalous with each retelling. The 8 men who had believed they each held a private secret now faced public exposure, mutual revelation, and the terrifying knowledge that they had all been manipulated by an enslaved woman, who should have been powerless, but had instead turned the instruments of their power against them. The crisis was no longer containable. The question was, what would happen next? Just when it seemed the situation couldn't become more volatile, word reached Riverbend that one of the 8 men had taken action far more dramatic than anyone anticipated. But before we discover what happened, I need to pause and ask for your help. Stories like this one documenting the hidden complexities of American history require tremendous research and careful reconstruction from fragments of historical records. If this story is giving you chills, if you're as disturbed and fascinated as I am by how one woman manipulated an entire county's power structure, I need you to do 3 things right now. Hit that like button to support our content. Share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries and subscribe to Liturgy of Fear if you haven't already. These stories deserve to be told and your engagement makes that possible. Now, let's discover together what desperate measure one of these men took when he realized his entire life was about to be destroyed. The news arrived at Riverbend in the early morning of November 27, carried by a steamboat crewman who had witnessed the event firsthand. William Dvor had disappeared. The Delta Star remained docked at Helena, its cargo half-loaded, its crew waiting for a captain who never returned from what was supposed to be a brief visit to Riverbend. Dvor had last been seen on the evening of November 26 walking along the river road toward Helena, carrying a satchel that witnesses later realized must have contained all his savings and personal documents. He had simply vanished, abandoning his livelihood, his boat, and his entire existence in Arkansas without explanation. For the other 7 men, Dvor's disappearance served as a stark demonstration of what exposure could cost. A man could lose everything, could be forced to flee completely, could watch his entire life collapse because of association with one enslaved woman's scheme. The realization crystallized the stakes in ways that abstract fear never could. But Dvor's flight also removed one player from an already complex situation, and nature abhors a vacuum. By November 28, the remaining 7 men were forced to make decisions they had been avoiding, to take positions they had hoped to defer, to choose between continued concealment and some form of coordinated response. Benjamin Yates, whose legal filing had temporarily blocked Celia's sale, now found himself in the strange position of leading a group he had never intended to join. 4 of the other men, Dr. Rankin, Samuel Pritchard, Reverend Hartwell, and even Josiah Farrell, approached him separately over the course of 2 days, each ostensibly seeking legal advice, but actually probing to understand who else was involved and what strategies might protect them all. Yates, trained to identify patterns and connections, gradually assembled the complete picture. 8 men including himself, 1 woman, 1 claimed pregnancy, multiple attempts to purchase freedom. A scheme of extraordinary sophistication that had played on each man's specific vulnerabilities, and now with Tucker's public testimony and divorce flight, the likelihood of exposure that would destroy careers, marriages, and reputations. On the evening of November 29, Yates did something unprecedented. He sent discreet messages to Rankin, Pritchard, Hartwell, and Farrell requesting a private meeting at his law office after normal business hours. He included Hamilton Drury in this summons, presenting it as a legal consultation about the court challenge to Celia sale. Virgil Tucker, unemployed and bitter, was not invited, which would prove significant. 6 men gathered in Yates's office on the evening of November 30. The meeting, which left no official record, but was later reconstructed from participants' private correspondence, must have been an extraordinary moment of collective realization. Each man discovered that others he knew socially and professionally were implicated in the same scheme. The silence as they looked at each other, recognizing shared guilt and mutual vulnerability, reportedly lasted several minutes. Yates, as the convener and the one with most experience managing complex negotiations, spoke first. He laid out what he understood of the situation. Celia had somehow managed to convince multiple men that they had fathered her child, had extracted promises and created legal documents, and had orchestrated a situation where maintaining individual secrecy was no longer possible because too many people were acting on conflicting agendas. He noted that Tucker's testimony, while delivered from spite, was accurate enough to be corroborated by other enslaved people at Riverbend. He observed that DVR's flight suggested the magnitude of consequences each of them might face if the situation became fully public. Then he proposed a solution that was both pragmatic and morally bankrupt. Collective silence purchased through collective action. If all 6 men present agreed to pool resources, they could purchase Celia from Drury at a price inflated enough to satisfy his wounded pride and Margaret Drury's demands for removal. They could arrange for her to be relocated far from Phillips County, but under circumstances that weren't punitive. They could ensure that Tucker was paid enough to keep silent about what he knew. And most importantly, they could present a fide front of denial if questions were raised, each man vouching for the other's character, creating a wall of respectability that would make accusations seem implausible. The proposal was brilliant in its corruption. It transformed individual guilt into collective protection, made each man's safety dependent on defending the others, and used the very power structures of Phillips County society to conceal the truth. Hamilton Drury agreed immediately, seeing an opportunity to profit from his wife's moral outrage while removing the source of scandal from his property. Samuel Pritchard agreed because the business logic appealed to him and because maintaining his cotton factor relationships required avoiding any public controversy. Dr. Rankin agreed because he genuinely wanted Celia freed from Drury's ownership and saw this as the only practical path to that outcome. Reverend Hartwell agreed because the alternative was acknowledging publicly that he had violated every principle he preached. Only Josiah Farrell hesitated. He argued that simply relocating Celia didn't address the fundamental issue of her condition, of the child she carried, of paternity that remained undetermined. He suggested that perhaps one of them should actually take responsibility, should purchase her freedom properly, should ensure she and the child had protection. The other men's response to his suggestion revealed the limits of their concern. They pointed out that any individual taking such action would implicitly admit paternity, would mark himself as different from the others, would sacrifice his reputation for uncertain benefit. Better to maintain collective deniability to ensure Celia was provided for without any of them being specifically identified as responsible, the meeting concluded with an agreement: each man would contribute funds proportional to his means. Drury would accept payment of $1,200 for Celia, far more than her market value. Yates would arrange her sale to a contact in Missouri, who would subsequently manumit her, creating legal distance between the Phillips County men and her freedom. Tucker would receive $200 in exchange for leaving Arkansas and never speaking publicly about Riverbend. The total cost split among 6 men was manageable for all of them and cheap compared to the potential cost of exposure, but the meeting had excluded 2 crucial participants in the drama, Celia herself and Virgil Tucker, the dismissed overseer whose bitterness at exclusion would prove fatal to their carefully constructed plan. Tucker learned about the meeting through the networks of information that white people consistently underestimated. An enslaved man who worked in the building where Yates's office was located observed the unusual evening gathering and reported it to others, and the information reached Tucker through channels designated to be invisible to white observation. Tucker understood immediately what was happening. The wealthy men were closing ranks, protecting each other, and leaving him excluded from their protection and their financial settlement. On the night of December 1st, Tucker broke into Benjamin Yates' law office and stole documents from the files related to Celia's case. These documents, which Yates had meticulously maintained, included copies of the purchase offers from Rankin and Pritchard, the court filing challenging the sale, correspondence between participants, and Yates's own notes about the coordinated strategy. Tucker's theft wasn't random vandalism but calculated acquisition of evidence that could destroy the men who had excluded him. Tucker's plan was to use the stolen documents to extract payment far larger than the $200 they had offered. He would threaten public exposure backed by documentary proof unless each man paid him separately and substantially. It was blackmail. But Tucker had calculated that his former authority over enslaved people, his willingness to oust violence, and his position as a white man would protect him from serious consequences even if his scheme was discovered. He was wrong. On December 3, Tucker approached Samuel Pritchard at his cotton factor's office in Helena, presenting copies of documents and demanding $1,000 for their return and his continued silence. Pritchard, terrified by the material evidence Tucker displayed, promised to gather the funds and arranged to meet Tucker the following evening at a warehouse near the river where Pritchard sometimes conducted business. Pritchard immediately contacted the other 5 men and described Tucker's threat. The group reconvened hurriedly, this time at Drury's Riverbend plantation rather than in town, and discussed their options. The conversation, reconstructed later from fragmentary evidence and one participant's guilty conscience, reveals how quickly respected citizens could contemplate extreme solutions when threatened with exposure. Several options were discussed. Paying Tucker's demands, which would likely lead to escalating extortion, having Tucker arrested for theft, which would require explaining what documents he stole and why they existed. Intimidating Tucker into leaving Arkansas immediately, which might not work given his desperation. According to later testimony, it was Josiah Frell who suggested the most direct solution, noting that Tucker had no family in Arkansas, no employer who would miss him, no social position that would prompt investigation if he disappeared. What happened next remains disputed in its exact details, but the outcome is grimly certain. On the evening of December 4th, Virgil Tucker went to the warehouse where he expected to collect payment from Samuel Pritchard. He was found 3 days later in the Mississippi River, his body caught against a fallen tree 15 miles south of Helena. The county coroner, who owed political favors to several prominent planters, ruled the death an accidental drowning, suggesting Tucker had been drinking and fell into the river. No stolen documents were ever recovered. The investigation, such as it was, concluded within days. Virgil Tucker was buried in an unmarked grave, and the matter was officially closed. But Tucker's death, whether murder or sumless direct removal, fundamentally changed the nature of what had begun as Celia's scheme. She had manipulated powerful men, had created conflict and exposure, had nearly achieved freedom through intelligence and careful planning, but the men she had manipulated possessed power that extended beyond legal mechanisms. Power that included violence when other methods failed. On December 8, Hamilton Drury informed Celia that she was being sold. The buyer was identified as a cotton factor from Missouri, the price as $1,200, the transaction as completely legal and proper. Celia would travel upriver immediately before winter weather made river passage impossible. There was no discussion of manumission, no promise of freedom, no acknowledgement of any arrangement beyond a simple sail. Celia understood immediately what had happened. The 8 men had discovered each other, had coordinated their response, and had neutralized her leverage by acting collectively rather than individually. Her scheme, which had depended on isolation and competing individual interests, had failed once the men unified, and Tucker's disappearance sent an unmistakable message about what happened to people who threatened Phillips County's respectable citizens with exposure. On December 10, 1857, Celia was placed aboard a steamboat headed upriver to Missouri. She carried with her a small bundle of possessions, a pregnancy that was visibly advanced, and the knowledge that she had come closer to freedom through her own efforts than most enslaved people ever managed, only to have that freedom snatched away by the same collective power that held millions in bondage. The historical record becomes fragmented after her departure from Phillips County. Missouri documents show the purchase of an enslaved woman matching Celia's description by a man named Gerard Wickham, a legitimate cotton factor who had business relationships with Arkansas planters. But Wickham's records also show that this woman was manumitted in February 1858, shortly after giving birth to a daughter, and subsequently left Missouri for an unknown destination. Whether this manumission represented a delayed fulfillment of the Phillips County men's original agreement, or whether Wickham was moved by Celia's situation to free her independently, or whether Celia managed to negotiate her own freedom through yet another scheme, remains unknown. The paper trail ends with the manumission document and Celia disappears from historical records entirely. The 8 men of Phillips County who had been drawn into Celia's web experienced varied fates that reflected their different levels of involvement and visibility in the scandal that never quite became public. Hamilton Drury continued operating Riverbend Plantation until his death in 1866, shortly after the Civil War's conclusion. His marriage to Margaret survived but never recovered its earlier closeness. He never acknowledged any relationship with Celia and successfully maintained that he had simply been the victim of an enslaved woman's manipulation and other men's inappropriate interest in his property. His daughters married respectably, and the family's reputation remained intact enough to withstand the post-war social disruptions. Josiah Frell sold his plantation in 1859 and relocated to Texas, citing business opportunities, but actually fleeing the memories and complications of Phillips County. He died there in 1871, childless despite 3 marriages, leaving his estate to Atchich organization that probably never knew about the events of 1857. Samuel Pritchard's cotton factor business collapsed in 1861 when war disrupted river commerce. He tried tour build after the war, but never regained his previous success. His wife's family connections dissolved when their Memphis relatives lost their wealth during Reconstruction. He died in 1878, financially comfortable, but politically irrelevant, having never achieved the ambitions that had driven him. Dr. James Rankin continued practicing medicine in Phillips County until his death in 1883. He never remarried, never mentioned Celia in any surviving correspondence, and maintained a reputation as a competent physician with a certain sadness about him that people attributed to his dead wife rather than his guilty conscience. Reverend Thomas Hartwell experienced a mental breakdown in 1859 that forced him to leave his congregation. He returned to Virginia where he lived with relatives and apparently never preached again. His death in 1865 was attributed to melancholia, a diagnosis that likely reflected what would now be recognized as severe depression and guilt. William DeVore never returned to Arkansas. Rumors placed him in New Orleans, then California, but no confirmed sighting was ever documented. The Delta Star was eventually sold to pay debts, and DeVore's name disappeared from steamboat registries. He had successfully erased his entire previous existence, the most complete escape any of the 8 managed. Benjamin Yates continued practicing law in Phillips County throughout the war and Reconstruction. That he destroyed all documents related to Celia's case shortly after her departure, eliminating evidence that might have later proved problematic. Headied in 1889, respected and successful, taking his secrets to the grave. Only a private letter found after his death written to a cousin in 1880, contained any acknowledgement of the events. Irons participated in a matter that troubles my conscience still, though I convinced myself at the time that I acted properly. We are skilled at constructing justifications for behavior we know to be wrong. Of Virgil Tucker, almost nothing remained. He had no family to memorialize him, no proper title pass on, no reputation to defend after death. The circumstances of his drowning were never seriously questioned, and his grave was eventually lost as the small cemetery where he was buried fell into disrepair. That he had been a tool of planter power, casually discarded when he became inconvenient. The enslaved community at Riverbend and throughout Phillips County preserved their own version of the story, passing it through oral tradition that white people never heard. In these accounts, Celia was remembered not as a victim, but as a strategist who had nearly defeated the system that enslaved her, who had turned powerful men against each other, who had demonstrated that intelligence and careful planning could shake even structures that seemed unbreakable. The fact that she ultimately didn't escape slavery through her scheme mattered less than the fact that she tried, that she fought using the only weapons available to her, and that she forced 8 white men to reveal their hypocrisy and fear. The child Celia carried, born in February 1858, according to Missouri records, was recorded as female and given the name Sarah. Beyond that bare notation, no information survives, whether Sarah grew up free, whether she ever knew her mother's history, whether she survived infancy in an era when mortality rates were high for all children and especially for those born to newly freed women without resources, remains unknown. The historical significance of Celia's story extends beyond the individual facts. It reveals how enslaved people, even in the most oppressive circumstances, found ways to resist, manipulate, and challenge their oppressors. It demonstrates that intelligence and strategy were tools of survival and resistance that didn't leave obvious marks in historical records, but were no less real for their invisibility. It shows how white Southern society's deepest fears about miscegenation, about loss of control, about the humanity and agency of enslaved people were grounded in accurate recognition of realities that the system tried desperately to deny. The story also reveals the length to which powerful men would go to protect their reputations and maintain social order. The probable murder of Virgil Tucker, the coordinated deception about Celia's sale and manumission, the destruction of documentary evidence, and the collective silence maintained for decades afterward, all demonstrate that Southern society was built not just on explicit violence, but on sophisticated mechanisms of concealment and collective denial. Phillips County continued as a major cotton-producing region until the Civil War disrupted the slave labor system that had made that production possible. The war brought massive changes. Enslaved people freed themselves by fleeing to Union lines, plantations were abandoned or destroyed, the cotton economy collapsed. But the habits of secrecy, the patterns of exploitation, and the willingness of respectable citizens to coordinate in protecting their interests survived the war and shaped Reconstruction and beyond. In the decades after 1857, Phillips County never publicly acknowledged the story of Celia and the 8 men. No newspaper ever reported it. No court records preserved it. No official history mentioned it. The silence was so complete that the story would have been entirely lost if not for scattered documents that survived accidentally. Private letters that descendants didn't destroy. Plantation ledgers that recorded unusual transactions without explaining them, and oral traditions maintained by descendants of enslaved people who remembered what their ancestors told them. The story raises questions that have no comfortable answers. How many similar schemes were attempted by enslaved women who left no trace in the historical record? How often did powerful men coordinate to conceal their exploitation and maintain appearances? How much of what we think we know about slavery is actually carefully constructed fiction designed to hide uncomfortable truths? The fact that 8 white men in one Arkansas county could be simultaneously manipulated by an enslaved woman suggests that such manipulation was possible, that the power imbalance of slavery was never as absolute as masters wanted to believe, and that intelligence and strategy could be weapons even when physical resistance was impossible. But the fact that those 8 men ultimately succeeded in silencing Celia, removing her from Phillips County, and eliminating any evidence of their behavior, reminds us that individual resistance, no matter how brilliant, had limits that only systemic change could overcome. Celia's freedom, if she achieved it, came at the price of exile from everyone she had known, permanent separation from her community, and the erasure of her story from official memory. The child born from this situation, Sarah, embodies the ambiguity and tragedy of the entire episode. She was both the product of exploitation and potentially the path to freedom. She was both evidence of white men's violations and a symbol of enslaved women's determination to survive and create meaning from horror. She carried in her body the question that haunted Southern society. What did it mean to be a child of a white father and an enslaved mother in a system that denied the humanity of both relationship and offspring? These questions resonate far beyond Phillips County, Arkansas in 1857. They speak to the fundamental nature of power, resistance, justice, and memory. They remind us that history is always more complex than official records suggest, that the people who left no documents were no less intelligent or strategic than those whose papers fill archives, and that silence in the historical record often indicates not absence of events, but successful concealment. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Celia ultimately achieved freedom? Or did the system that enslaved her maintain control even after she left Arkansas? How do we honor the intelligence and courage of people whose resistance left almost no trace in official records? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. This story represents countless similar stories that were never preserved, never acknowledged, never given the weight they deserved in our understanding of American history. If this narrative moved you, if it made you think differently about resistance and power, then subscribe to Liturgy of Fear. Hit the notification bell to never miss stories like this. And share this video with someone who needs to hear it. These stories matter. These voices, silent in official records, deserve to be heard. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next exploration of America's hidden history.